Hi students, what we're going to be doing today is having a look at USA's tactics and strategy during the Vietnam War from the period of 1961 to 1968. This forms part of the syllabus dot point on the nature and effectiveness of the strategy and tactics employed by the United States of America. The timeline, what we're going to be looking at, is the period from 1961 to 1965, which we can summate to be sort of the counterinsurgency strategy employed by America. Then from 1965 to 1966, after the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, we have the Americanization of the war and Westmoreland's search and destroy policy. And then from 1966 to 67, pacification, and then from 68 to 65, Vietnamization. The presidents that are involved in this period, as you can see there, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, and it follows what we've already been discussing in terms of foreign policy. Counterinsurgency. So this is the beginnings of America's strategy towards Vietnam. The MAG, or the Military Assistance Advisory Group, was established in 1950 in order to observe the distribution of American and French supplied equipment. This is during the First Indochina War, in which we have Americans' influence is fairly indirect, and they're supporting financially and obviously through providing equipment as well. After the Geneva Accords, the French permitted the US to join in the organization and training of the Vietnamese National Army, which by 1916 had altered in advisory combat units at a regimental level in the field, and by 1961 at a battalion level. It's quite unclear whether or how involved these advisors were in terms of fighting in the war or against the Viet Minh or Viet Cong. But what we can say is that their role increases greatly from the period of 54 to 1960 as French troops obviously leave Vietnam. US personnel, obviously we have advisory group set up, very, very small to begin with, no more than 200, and then growing to 500 advisors in 1960, and then to the grand total of 23,000 in 1964. And then from 1964, we have the change to a much more militaristic footing, and we have combat troops entering Vietnam. The key part of the counterinsurgency was the construction of the Strategic Hamlet Program, which we've already discussed. It was criticized by American leaders, as it forced them into a defensive position, and you can see the American advisors there assisting the Vietnamese national troops. And this program is very harshly criticized by both Americans and modern historians today, who viewed it as a way to disturb the local inhabitants of Vietnam. Counterinsurgency, again, continued on. MAG becomes MAC-V, gets sort of absorbed into it in 1962. And again, this is representative of the symbolic increase in Americans' policy towards Vietnam. They're becoming more and more involved in the quagmire of Vietnam, you might say. Again, another increase of advisors, leading to 9,000 in 1962. Kennedy's approach is still about hearts and minds. That's really evident in the Strategic Hamlet Program in order to avoid them being consumed by the propaganda of the Viet Cong. However, it's not. The effectiveness is obviously limited because the villages are moving away from their local inhabitants and into these hamlets created by the US. He took obviously extra funding again, another $50 million, and obviously the Gulf of Tonkin is that really key leading event which led to the widening of the war. But Johnson, very early on, is critical of fighting a war in which he believes that Asian boys should do instead of American. American escalation. Obviously 1964 we have the Gulf of Tonkin. Previous to that, we have Viet Cong attacks in Pleiku, in central Vietnam, and then as a reaction to those attacks, Rolling Thunder, Then continuing on, we have in March 1965, very, very importantly, 2 battalions of US Marines land to defend US air bases at Da Nang. Okay, these are the first combat troops in Vietnam. Then we have obviously the very somewhat gradual, but it definitely jumps up in 1966 of the rollout of American troops to Vietnam. The Rolling Thunder attempt, which we're going to look at in sort of more detail, is really designed to induce the North Vietnamese to negotiate. However, it's ineffective in allowing that, and which leads to more and more troops being committed to the war. Bombing. This is a key element of the American strategy, was on air superiority and making use of their technological advantage. First bombing raids in Pierce Arrow in August of 1964. These are retaliatory strikes after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and they target North Vietnamese naval vessels and patrol storage facilities in Vinh, which is in the north of Vietnam. Then from that, we have Flaming Dart Operations 1 and 2. These are reprisal attacks again after the attacks at Pleiku and Quy Nhon. Again, you can see the similarities between the two, the fact that they are retaliatory, okay, they're reactive to Vietnamese bombing and Vietnamese guerrilla tactics. They're not on the offensive, okay, which will come later in 1965. Then we obviously have the largest bombing campaign ever conducted by Americans, Rolling Thunder, which is adopted out of frustration in South Vietnam, and it's really focused on bombing them back to the Stone Age, of really hitting Vietnam in the mouth and trying to force them to the negotiation table. And it becomes an aim of strategic persuasion. However, the role switched in '66 when it was evident that the North Vietnamese army was not going to come to the table. The commanders, Ho Chi Minh, General Giap, and it switched to interdiction, okay, forcing the bombers to fly over the Ho Chi Minh Trail and try to slow down the wave of troops heading down through Laos and Cambodia and into the south of Vietnam. You can see the phases of Rolling Thunder there. You can see the different targets. The map really clearly shows of where they're trying to attack. A lot of the bombing is definitely centered around the Ho Chi Minh Trail and around the DMZ area in the Quang Tri province. And you can see the types of facilities and types of targets they're attacking, very much on the infrastructure and trying to destabilize the Vietnamese war machine in order to inflict heavy losses. And later on in 66 and 67, that leads to a lot of collateral damage as they bomb very close to Hanoi and the industrial targets around Hanoi. In 1965, okay, obviously we have troops on the ground. William Westmoreland, commander of the MACV, he continues the rhetoric about winning in hearts and minds, but does it in a very, very different sort of way. He continues the strategic Hamlet program, but does that through using Marines, called the Combined Action Program, in which Marines are actually placed within the towns and used to protect the people and tries to form a relationship with the people. March 1965, ground troops are deployed to defend air bases in the south of Vietnam. And by April, okay, they go on the offensive and they're given much more leeway to go into areas of Viet Cong control and try to wipe them out. Westmoreland's strategy overall can be described as a fire brigade concept, in which we have highly mobile, highly aggressive, long-range recon capability soldiers, and they are deployed into specific hot spots in order to deal with that. And then again, very somewhat reactionary. Even though they go on the offensive, they're definitely reacting to what's happening on patrols and the Viet Cong aggression. This is a video provided by the US Marines. It's about the Combined Action Program, and you're more than welcome to go back through the PowerPoint and watch it at a later stage. By 1965, we can still describe the Vietnam War as definitely limited. Despite having 10 divisions by 1968, American politics on the home front was definitely focused on limiting the rollout of troops into Vietnam, as they were afraid of the potential political and social backlash. Westmoreland's strategy, was twofold. It focused on defensive positions in enclaves, on coastal positions, and really holding those. These focused around providing air bases in order to provide quick reactionary forces to go out and bring about heavy bombing on the enemy very, very quickly. The other part of his strategy was aggressive search and destroy missions in which infantry troops would go out and search for the enemy and try to bring about their destruction. Logistical achievements such as Cam Bay were foundational to the fueling of the American war. So going into a little bit more detail about the Enclave Program, it was supported by General James Gavin, who outlined the US forces be concentrated into population areas and coastal bases, freeing up the Army of the Republic of Vietnam to carry out the brunt of the fight against the communists. And this is built on the idea that we don't want a big war in Vietnam. We want to still, despite having combat troops in Vietnam, still provide that training to the South Vietnamese in order to fight their own war. US forces might be committed if opportunities did become available in pitched battles. However, they were focused much more on the defensive position. It did allow communists obviously strategic advantage as they were unable, or the US was unable to provide the firepower and maneuverability on the actual battlefield, and it offered the best hope of buying time to train the AVRN, and most importantly, reducing US casualties and minimizing that political pressure. So you can see the way in which strategy and tactics in Vietnam, especially early on, are definitely influenced by politics on the home front, and that becomes even more and more important as, in part two, what we're going to look at is the slowly rollback of American escalation. General Westmoreland definitely opposed the Enclave strategy, calls for more of a taking the battle to the enemy approach, and obviously leads to more and more men, and he has a constant relationship with Johnson asking for more men, 100,000 more every single year. We get more and more troops arriving in Vietnam in order to carry out their strategy. So Westmoreland's strategy, unlike the Enclave strategy supported by General Gavin, was about attrition. You might refer to this as body count syndrome as well. This aims to destroy the opponents at a faster rate than the Democratic Republic of Vietnam or the Viet Cong could replace them. His real motto, you might say, if you grab them by the balls, the hearts and minds will follow, and that's obviously building on what Kennedy said much earlier. Ground troops, he believed, would conduct search and destroy missions. The US forces rely on intel and air mobile combat units to exploit the opportunity, and this body count system really leads to a competition between commanders, and it really leads to problems in their strategy, in the fact that they can't identify who's a target, who's a civilian, and it leads to the worsening of relationships between the Vietnamese people and Americans. And their real focus, and Westmoreland's focus at the time, is if it's dead and it's Gook, it's VC. So you can see the racist sentiment within their sort of strategy as well. Neil Sheehan, author of A Bright Shining Lie, challenges that prosecuting a war of attrition, and he says that the building of a killing machine had become an end in itself, and the fact that Westmoreland was consumed by the idea of just wanting to decimate the Vietnamese populations. This is also evident in what happens in My Lai and the General William Pierce's inquiry. He contends that the problem with the body count method was that with improper leadership, body count could create competition between units, particularly if these statistics were compared like baseball standings, and there was no stringent requirement as to how and by whom the counts were to be made. So we really need to be careful when we're dealing with casualty statistics, because a lot of the time they're manipulated by the commanders in order to provide a favorable view of what was happening out on the front, even though we have many more casualties for the Americans and much less for the Vietnamese. And you can see the impact of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution on that map there really, really clearly. You can see the way that in 1963 we have, under 20,000 advisors, or just over, I should say, just over 20,000 advisors in Vietnam, and how that shift to a much more military focus with the rollout of combat troops in 65 and the slow progression up to 2,000 troops, and then doubling in 1967, all the way up until just over 500,000 troops in 1968. This is an excerpt from General Westmoreland's retrospective and his justification of the attrition strategy. He really outlines 6 key elements to the strategy. The first, he says, was about bolstering the South Vietnamese by sending advisors and logistical and economic support in the hope that this could stop and reverse the subversive efforts of the communists within South Vietnam. So his key there is obviously focused on indirect. Okay, it's really focused on providing economic and logistical support as opposed to being directly involved in the war. He then states that the gradual escalation and putting pressure on North Vietnam through strategic bombing. The third, base security, which is an adjunct to the decision to bomb North Vietnam. This is around strategic hamlets, getting those enclaves up and running. The fourth, that's the Enclave Program again. Fifth, a gradual build-up of forces in the south for the purpose of putting maximum pressure on the communist structure and the forces in the south, emphasizing pacification and nation building. Okay, it can be argued that these policies were never really well run during Westmoreland's time in Vietnam. And the final, maximum expansion of the Vietnamese armed forces, increasing efforts to pacify all South Vietnam, coupled with a gradual withdrawal or without negotiations. So you have there the really 6 key points on what Westmoreland believes was their strategy in Vietnam. However, it can be argued that pacification was ineffective, up until 1968. That nation building was failing much earlier on, before America even sent troops there. As we get Rusk, McNamara's reports come back that the Diem administration is unsuccessful. We've got coups. We have a people who are uprising against. We have the Buddhist monk problems. It's a real dire situation even before Westmoreland even gets to Vietnam. So the keys to their tactics, how did they wage war in Vietnam? The first of which, as I spoke about earlier, was air mobility. Dependence on technology was central to America's war. They used B-52 bombers, using carpet bombing, and they believed in air power. This was, however, very costly, both in ammunition and losses. The Rolling Thunder, despite it being one of the longest bombing campaigns of the American military history, is also one of the most ineffective because it didn't achieve its objective, which was forcing the North Vietnamese government to the negotiating table, nor did it bring about the necessary losses to stop the Vietnamese waging war. Helicopters, obviously you would have seen in before, and obviously Hollywood movies, central to the American war. They were used because of their flexibility in the landscape. If you look at the geography of Vietnam, you can see the terrain and how difficult it is to navigate, as well as bringing troops into battle, providing gunship support, positioning artillery, and carrying out medical evacuations. The 1st Cavalry Division was the sort of pioneer of these new strategies. American infantry were used as mostly bait in order to allure the enemy out and then have a larger force come in, supported by air mobility in order to intervene. The ground war. Okay, Americans who went to fight in Vietnam, as we spoke about in class, were mostly from working classes. Okay, they weren't a sample of the whole population. They're definitely skewed to much lower socioeconomic status. The draft for wealthy was able to be manipulated in a way in the fact that they didn't have to go to war, and the average age of US troops were about 19 as compared with Australia, which is about 26. American experience was informed by earlier wars. They were the sons of the heroes of World War I and World War II, and it was really focused around this corporate war. Okay, if we have more guns, we have more planes, we have more men, more tanks. Okay, and we're eventually going to be victorious because we have more, because we're just going to push the enemy to the point where they can no longer continue. And that's really the keys of attrition. Only 15% of Americans in Vietnam were combat roles, and you can see that again, going back to the air mobility, how costly this war was for America. And you can see Philip Capelletto's memoir there in 1977 talking about the war and the fact that Americans have never fought a war like this before in the jungle and not seeing the enemy and going for very long days without actual fighting. It's very difficult to obviously endure psychologically in that period of time as well. This is a great letter, okay, which sort of really highlights GI's experience during the war, and it's really focused on what was happening, and a really sort of a testament to their mentality at the time. Last but not least, technology, central to America's way of war. Okay, M16s are light, maneuverable, okay, rapid fire. However, they have a real problem with jamming. Okay, well, they've never been in these conditions before, and they needed to be very, very clean in order to be able to work effectively. Unlike that of the AK-47, which we'll look at in the Vietnam's way of waging war. Operation Ranch Hand led to 90 million gallons of Agent Orange and other herbicides being sprayed over Vietnam and Laos. Okay, these are effective defoliants and trying to get rid of the canopy in order to be able to see the enemy below. And this is obviously used very much on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. B-52 Stratofortress we've already talked about. Rolling Thunder, Arclight, Linebacker, 3 examples of where they were used. Cluster bombing, you know a lot about already the bombing used, and 580,000 bomb missions over Vietnam during the war, amounting to almost 2.5 million tons of explosive on the country. Napalm was both an effective physical and a psychological weapons. Helicopters, the Huey, the Cobra. Tanks did see action in Vietnam, however, they're mostly used as infantry support due to the geography, and they were very limited. There's no very limited tank-on-tank combat, despite the Vietnamese having Russian-made T-54s. They were equipped with 9mm gun and also flamethrowers, and the map there really highlights the areas affected by the US defoliants. So that's part 1 of 2 parts when we look at American tactics and strategy. So when you're writing your essay, you need to really focus on what's the nature, what are the sort of the key elements of Americans' strategy. Really focus on search and destroy, use of technology, air mobility, and how the ground war was fought, and then how they obviously adapted over time and changed in order to sort of increase American escalation, and then from around Tet, the decrease and slow withdrawal of American troops.